And then which one of these is your PowerPoint there? And I'll get her a wireless mic.
Okay.
That'll be great.
Welcome, everybody, on the Zoom link. We'll be right with you for the webinar.
Check one.
You want that? Ready? All right, let's get the show on the road. We are privileged to have with us today Sahar Aziz of Rutgers University, who is a law professor and also a social scientist who has written a very important book about the racialization of the Muslim community in the United States. And you ask yourself, why were Muslims not given the full protections of the First Amendment with regard to freedom of worship? Her answer is they were treated more like a race, as minorities are sometimes treated in the United States, than they were like a religion. It's a very powerful argument. I'm not doing it justice with a quick summary, but it's worth looking at her book. And in fact, we have 4 copies right here. If anybody would like to purchase one before they leave, let us know, and you could get it signed. We're having a teach-in on Gaza, but also beyond Gaza, the experiences of Palestinians in various settings. I think it's really important with the campus atmosphere, both in Michigan and throughout the country, that we just educate ourselves on some of these issues. And we couldn't do better to have an educator among us than Sahar. So let me turn it over to her.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Cole, for inviting me, and to the student groups who co-sponsored this, to Professor Khalil and others who helped make this happen. It's always a delight to be at UMich. I think your football team is better than ours, is my understanding. So that's a, oh, go blue. Okay. I'm not allowed to say that. Scarlet Knights. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have everybody that's online and all, as well as in person. And as we all know right now, there is what I call a siege, and what I will argue are genocidal practices going on in Gaza by the Israeli government, which I welcome you to challenge during the Q&A, because we are in a academic setting, and I think this is the place where we don't all have to agree. And so I will be providing the history and the backdrop of the experience of Palestinians in Gaza. And so I think what's important just to note is that I am intentionally centering the experiences of Palestinians. And if you want exposure to the perspective of the Israelis, you can turn on mainstream American media, and you will get that 95% of the time. So I'm not worried that you're not going to get the other side's perspective. Actually, it's usually this perspective that you will rarely be exposed to. Okay, so let me turn on my mic. Yep. Can you all hear me? It's good? Okay, so let's, I gotta figure out how this works. 1 second. Okay, all right. It's not working. All right, little technical problem here. Maybe get the IT guy, because nothing. All right, 1 second. See if we can get this. There we go. All right.
Just go down on the slide.
Oh, you can see it? Okay. The problem is I can't see it. It's not, the problem is, give me 1 second. It's not working. Yeah, this is jammed.
That's not working. So it might
Small technical.
need
we
to
need
be
the tech.
plugged into something. Where is the PowerPoint? Here it is.
So we're just having a problem. Okay, let's try this again. All right, so just a few ground rules that I always have before I give teach-ins. The first is that the University of Michigan Student Code of Conduct applies to all students in attendance. I'll leave it to you all to look those up. All mention of Israel refers to a nation state. It should not be conflated with the Jewish people or world Jewry. And also, all mentions of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, or any Muslim majority countries any criticism of those states should not be conflated with criticism of Muslims or the religion of Islam. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are unacceptable and should not be tolerated at the University of Michigan or any other university. Anyone engaged in disruptive behavior will be removed from the room in order to allow other attendees to benefit from this educational program. And then finally, please be respectful and civil to the speaker, that would be me, and to each other. Okay, so just to give you a little roadmap of what I'll cover today. First, I'd like to have a moment of silence for the killings of civilians. And then I'll take a deep dive of Israel's occupation from 1967 to 2023. I'll share some resources that include the Palestinian experiences and perspectives, some action items for human rights advocacy and reporting, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. And then again, we'll have an open, civil and respectful discussion of current events. So my teach-in will focus on 67 to 2023, before October 7th. And then during the discussion, we could talk about the post-October 27th. So this is the death count at this point in time, and it's underestimated. 11,700 Palestinians, civilians have been killed by the Israeli military in Gaza. 4,500 Palestinian children have been killed by the Israeli military. And this is in the span of 5 weeks. That comes out to 1 Palestinian child killed every 10 minutes by the state of Israel. That is the equivalent of 430,000 American children killed in 5 weeks, if you were to do it by that ratio, because there are 1 million children or under the age, youth, minors in Gaza. 32,000 Palestinian civilians have been injured due to indiscriminate bombardment by the Israeli military, and 2,500 Palestinian civilians are missing under the rubble, presumed to be dead. under the residential buildings, universities, schools, hospitals, mosques. They were all bombed by the Israeli military. 1,230, I believe, Israelis have been killed by Hamas, all of them on October 7th, 2023. 230 Israelis are currently being held hostage by Hamas. US funding of Israel's siege on Gaza. Your country, the United States of America, with your money, provides $3.4 billion to the state of Israel every year. It also provides $1.3 billion to Egypt and $1.9 billion to Jordan, and hundreds of millions of $500 million to the Palestinian Authority, and hundreds of millions to other countries. But $3.4 billion per year comes out to about $160 billion to Israel since the early 1970s. It provides $0 to Hamas. And President Biden is now asking Congress to give an additional $14 billion to Israel in the next few weeks to fund its bombing of Palestinians in Gaza. And I believe it has already started the process of providing $300 million to Israel. So this is blocked from view because of what you guys can see, but there is a call to action. What's really important is that you all, if you care about stopping this trend, is that you all contact your elected officials every day. Send an email and call them to tell them that you want a ceasefire. Now, let's just take 15 seconds for a moment of silence for these tens of thousands of civilians that have been killed that I've listed here. All right. And we are blessed that these are not our children, our parents, our friends, our teachers, our professors, and people in our lives. Okay, so let's talk about Gaza. 2.3 million people live in Gaza. It is only 25 by 5 meters long, as you can see on this map. And 70% of the inhabitants of Gaza were actually refugees from the 1948 war, which was called the Nakba for Palestinians, the disaster, the catastrophe. And it was the independence war for the Israelis. Half of Gazans are under the age of 18. From 1948 to 1967, Egypt controlled Gaza. From 1967 to 2007, Israel controlled Gaza, both its borders and inside Gaza. From 2007 to the present, Gaza has been under a full Israeli-led and Egypt-supported land, sea, and air blockade. Now, inside Gaza, it was controlled by Hamas, which I'll talk about why through this presentation. The UN International Human Rights Organizations and many legal scholars regard the Gaza Strip to be under military occupation by Israel. So even though Hamas is both the government of Gaza and the militia group, or terrorist group, or insurgency group, or whatever you want to call them, but they have both a violent or a militant side, and they also have a governance side, which is running Gaza and has been running Gaza since 2007. We'll talk a little bit about the origins of Hamas in a different slide. Okay, so between 67 to 87, that was 20 years, fully controlled by Israel, inside and outside. And effectively, at this time, the Palestinian nationalism was criminalized. Israel arrested and deported Palestinians who resisted its rule, and also frequently and indiscriminately detained masses of protesters. So anyone who even held this poster, this was considered illegal because it represented the colors of the Palestinian flag. And so on average, 32 Palestinians were killed per year by Israel, coming out to about 650 Palestinians. And this gives you a little bit of perspective of the murder rate that's happened in the last 5 weeks as compared to the last 53 years. And Israel banned any political expressions of Palestinian identity or nationality, artwork made of green, red, black, and white, Palestinian flags, anything advocating for Palestinian independence, any assembly of greater than 10 people for a political purpose was criminalized. It means it was grounds for detention. And the Israeli government is notorious for torturing Palestinians. And again, all of this is nothing new. There are plenty of human rights reports to document this, including Israeli human rights organizations. Israel censored textbooks, magazines, and newspapers and banned more than 1,600 books. Now, one of the strategies of occupation was economic destruction of the Gazan economy and complete dependence of Gazans or Palestinians on the Israeli economy. And so in order for any investment, industry, entrepreneurship to happen, Palestinians had to get permits from Israel. For example, if they wanted to involve land and property, install a water device, perform electrical work, or connect a generator. And ultimately, the goal was to make Gaza's Palestinians dependent on Israel for employment. Israel created zones exclusively for fishing vessels. Now, fishing was a major source of revenue and business because Gaza is on the Mediterranean Sea. But it ultimately killed the fishing industry over time in order both to, again, make Gazans have to buy, or Palestinians have to buy the fish if they could afford it from Israel, but also to kill its own industry. So many Gazan fishermen went out of business in those 20 years. Also, if you were a Palestinian and you wanted to plant a new citrus tree, if you wanted to replace a non-productive tree, if you wanted to plant other fruit trees, you could not do so without permission from the Israeli government. It was illegal. And in order to get one, it took about 5 years. The Israelis also shut down Arab financial institutions, including banks, and froze their assets. So the result was financial credit banking systems were really never developed to facilitate capital-intensive investment in Gaza, and Palestinians were handcuffed into trying to build companies that could establish a self-sustaining economic base. And this has disastrous consequences in the 90s and beyond. Remember, before 67, and especially before 48, but before 67, Gaza had its own economy. Right? It had Palestinians are real. They were the indigenous people, and they had their own economic means of production. The Israelis also prevented Palestinian farmers from growing many types of fruits and vegetables so as to protect Israeli firms from competition and ultimately shrinking Gaza's economic base. Israel also prohibited Palestinians in Gaza from making critical improvements in their sewage system in Gaza. And as a result, by the 1990s in Gaza City, as much as 50% of all piped water was lost as a result of damage to the pipes. And this is a theme that you see a lot, which is that Israel, even after 2007, when it controlled the borders but didn't control internally the governance, a common theme is Palestinians could not improve anything. They couldn't fix anything. They couldn't build anything without the permission of Israel, which was rarely granted and often delayed. So as a result, again, the economy was completely dependent. Now, the other aspect of occupation in Gaza is because 70,000 Palestinians in 1948 were actually not from Gaza. They were from what is now Israel proper, or from the West Bank, or from Jerusalem. They had family, extended family, that were not in Gaza, and they had to get a permit in order to have them come visit or for them to travel to see their families, which was often denied. And this had just a personal effect on their ability to stay connected to their extended family. And by the mid-1980s, Israel tightened the process of family reunification for Palestinians in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, and requests were rarely granted. So you have people who live in Gaza, who have lived in Gaza, who have never seen their family in the West Bank or Jerusalem as a result of these very strict rules. So you're talking now 20 years, 67 to 87. And you can see the conditions are not ideal, and they're totally controlled by Israel. So over time, tensions started to arise. Palestinians started to be very frustrated with their conditions. And younger people started to see that, realize there was no future. They were just trapped in this small strip of land, and you started to see what we call disturbances. So many of them is the rock throwing, it's maybe protests, rallies, strikes, because this was not sustainable and the conditions were worsening over time. And at 1987, then is the first intifada, which is the revolt. Now it happened both in the West Bank and Gaza, but it actually started, it was triggered by an event in Gaza. And the underlying conditions, in addition to what I just described, that helped or that contributed to it occurring in 1987 were the Palestinian workers who were increasingly dependent on Israel in order to survive as the economy in Gaza was shrinking, were reporting constant verbal and physical abuse in the workplace by Israelis, including being cheated out of wages, forced to work under inhumane conditions, exposed to retaliation following attacks on Israelis, and feeling humiliated and dehumanized at roadblocks and checkpoints. And this is really the story of Palestinian life under occupation. It's a story of humiliation. It's a story of constant dehumanization and sometimes even physical violent repression. So to give you an idea of kind of the conditions under which Palestinians lived in 1986, which was right before the first Intifada, there was a poll that was taken, and the following percentage of Palestinians in the occupied territories indicated that they individually or a member of their family had experienced the following. 47% of Palestinians said they individually or their immediate family, nuclear family, had been politically arrested, had been subject to political arrest by Israel. 50% had been beaten, physically abused, or threatened by Israel, the Israeli military. 55% of Palestinians had experienced harassment or direct insults at military operation checkpoints. 23% had their property or land confiscated. 34% were banned from travel abroad. 74% were subject to a curfew. 17% demolition or sealing of homes. 15% were deported from their towns. And this is cut off for this. And then only 6% of Palestinians that were polled said none of this had ever happened to them or their immediate family. So this is the reality that they were living. And one of the objectives for me to just bring out these facts is for you to imagine yourself living in those conditions and asking yourself, how would you respond? Okay. Now, the immediate trigger, because every time there's a revolution or a revolt, there's usually a trigger, even though that's not what actually caused the revolution or the revolt. If you study the Arab Spring, you'll know that it was in the making for many decades, arguably, not at least years. Is in 1987, an Israeli truck driver struck and killed 4 Palestinians near a checkpoint at the entrance of Gaza. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And at that point, an uprising swept across the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and set in motion a series of daily strikes, protests, riots, boycotts of Israeli rule, and infamously, the stone-throwing children. The first Intifada was notably nonviolent, in contrast to the second Intifada, which I'll get to. So I want you to also think about both the points in time when the Palestinians revolted nonviolently and when the Palestinians revolted violently. And ask yourself if there was a difference in the Israeli response. Ask yourself if there was a difference in the international response, because they have tried both. Right? This is, again, a 60+ year occupation. So then the first 2 years of the uprising, 175,000 Palestinians passed through Israeli jails. 30,000 Palestinian children needed medical treatment after being beaten by soldiers. 10,000 had broken bones. 1/5 of the injured were under the age of 5. So the Israeli military was breaking the bones of 5-year-olds and below. This is the cruelty. This is the reality that Palestinians have been living under, again, long before October 7th. 23,000 Palestinians were subject to harsh interrogation or torture, and Israel ultimately, can't read that other part, but ultimately Israel was detaining and arresting thousands of Palestinians. And this again was the non-violent Intifada, okay? Meaning that this, well, I'll talk about Hamas in a minute, but this was mainly young people stone throwing, burning tires, right? Maybe throwing cocktail Molotovs against a very strong and powerful military vis-a-vis these young men. So the question I always ask, I'm a critical race theorist, so race is always on my mind. And I always ask audiences, what would white Americans do if living under Israeli occupation for 53 years, the one that I'm describing? You're asking, why are you talking about white Americans? Because white Americans in the United States are the ones whose humanity is recognized. Because that's what white privilege is. When you feel pain, it's recognized. When you're humiliated, it's recognized. When you're dying or you're dead, your life is valuable. I think a lot of you are a generation of the Black Lives Matter movement. So you understand the issue, right, when it comes to Black lives. And then there's a hierarchy with Black on the bottom, white on the top, and then everyone else in the middle that moves around. And so where do Muslims' lives matter? Or where do they lie? Where do Palestinian lives lie? Okay, so now let's talk about Hamas, because that's all the Western media wants to talk about is Hamas, 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 Hamas. Hamas is what we call a hybrid organization. So if you study terrorism like I do, you don't sit there and go bad and good, evil and good. You ask yourself questions like, why do non-state actors, why are they formed in the first place? Why do they use violence? Why do they use nonviolence? Why do they have legitimacy in countering state violence and state repression? And many of you learned this when you were learning about the American Revolution. Right? Because remember, the founders of your country were terrorists in Britain. They were terrorists in Britain. Okay. So in 1973, Ahmed Yassin, along with two other members, founded an Islamic charity in Gaza, focused on education, social services, and preaching. He learned from the Egyptian Brotherhood that as long as the organization stayed out of politics and limited its activities to education and spiritual guidance, Israel would leave it alone. So it did not actually start out as a militant group, and it did not start out as a political group, though it did transform and transition. It developed youth sports, cultural activities, social services for the poor and orphans, and they spread around Gaza and the West Bank, enrolling thousands of students in schools and kindergartens run by the Islamic movement. And this is a very common trend among religious organizations, whether they're Jewish, whether they're evangelical Christian, whether they're Hindu, but this is not unusual for what we call missionary work, right? So Muslims do missionary work too. And as a result, you can gain a lot of followers that way because you provide them with food, you provide them with shelter, you provide them with education, you provide them with medical care. So in the 1970s and 80s, Yassin penetrated Palestinian society by creating cells of 3 members each throughout Gaza and reaching most neighborhoods. Now, I can't do justice to the history of Hamas or any, this is a 1-hour teach-in. This is something that people do PhDs in. And so there's a lot of debate as to what was their original intent, what was their ultimate ulterior motives. That's a conversation we can have if we're just going to do something only on Hamas. But this was their history, at least in the 70s and up to the first Intifada. Okay, so Hamas is kind of the big monster, what's always vilified in Western media. And one thing you always have to ask yourself is, why do non-state actors engage in violence? Have they ever attempted to engage in peace? And what has been the response by the more powerful state actor and their allies? So in 1988, which was 1 year after the Intifada started, or a little less than a year, Hamas put out peace feelers with Israel. And so in 1988, Hamas leader Mahmoud al-Zahar proposed a peaceful resolution. He submitted his proposal to Yitzhak Rabin, the then Israeli Minister of Defense, in a meeting on June 1st, 1988. And the proposed solution was as follows. He expressed interest in negotiating with Israel and had to acknowledge the Palestinian, as long as Israel acknowledged the Palestinian right to self-determination and the right to return to the land. And in response, Hamas was willing to think about or consider the 1967 borders, because the big dispute was, is it from, what is now Israel, all of Palestine, or is it the West Bank and Gaza? And Hamas has always said, and so did the PLO, that it was from the river to the sea. And I'll talk a little bit more during Q&A about why that term from the river to the sea was at one point very offensive to Jews, and to some Jews it still is, but why it has actually changed in meaning, according to some. So this is where I'm a little bit, I can't seem to move this. I want to be able to read the whole thing. Anyway, this was effectively what he sent to Yitzhak Rabin and told him, look, we are willing to consider going into peace negotiations and restore, as long as the occupied areas are turned over to a neutral party, such as the UN, the European Common Market, the Arab League, or the Organization of African States. The Palestinian people will name their representative by the means that will satisfy everyone without Israel having the slightest right in this matter, unless the Palestinians are granted the same right to Israeli representation. The stage of final settlement will be conducted by negotiations between the parties concerned in order to define the nature of relations among these parties. So effectively, it was kind of like an early version of the Oslo, but ultimately ended up being the Oslo Accords. It was rejected by the Israeli side. Now, go back. So this is June 1st, 1988, okay? In 1987, Hamas had not gotten involved in the Intifada in the beginning, but it had competitors. There was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and there was Islamic Jihad, and there were other non-state actors, some of whom used violence as a form of resistance. And in fact, the PLO, which was led by Yasser Arafat, was designated as a terrorist group by Israel, by the United States, while Hamas was not even on the map because they were, again, mainly a social service organization. When this was rejected, look at June 1st, 1988, 2 months later, Hamas publishes its infamous new charter, which is what is commonly cited in the Western media, which it says that its goal is to establish an Islamic state throughout Palestine, and renounces any part of Palestine means renouncing part of the religion of Islam. And effectively, the Hamas charter defines the Palestinian struggle as one against the Jews, and that Israel was a completely illegitimate state. Okay, so this charter was passed, and they took a very hard line, right? Which is, we do not recognize Israel. This entire land belongs to Palestinians. So in 1989 to 2000 is when you start to see the suicide bombings. Because before then, again, and this is where you have to divide. Hamas and the Palestinians are not one. There are multiple groups within Palestinian society, and this is something you should take in a Palestine studies class and to understand. Just like in the United States, you can't say that one evangelical Christian group represents all Christians, right? Or one Jewish American group represents all Jews. So there's a lot of infighting, and there's a lot of disagreement as to strategies for resistance of the occupation. So Hamas starts its suicide bombings, which ultimately hardened opinion in Israel, public opinion against the occupation or against Palestinians. And it also imposed a very personal cost to Israelis, which again, as analysts, we can say it wasn't effective. It was effective, but that was the strategy that Hamas used. But not every Palestinian used that. Some were just rock throwing. Some weren't involved at all in the resistance. So 185 Israelis were killed from 89 to 2000. That's an 11-year period, and 1,200 Israelis were wounded. By 1996, Hamas had carried out one of its deadliest attacks, which killed 25 Israelis and injured more than 80 in Jerusalem. The bomb ripped through a bus during morning rush hour in Jerusalem, killing 23 people and injuring 49 Israelis. The 10-kilogram bomb was packed with nails, ball bearings, bullets that shredded human flesh and made identification of bodies extremely difficult. The bus was reduced to a charred skeleton. So this was a big turning point in Israel, and much of this was heavily covered in Western media. And that was effectively the image of the Palestinian resistance. And the response was to become less and less sympathetic to the Palestinian perspective. Because with every suicide bombing, Israeli public opinion hardened, and hawks in the Israeli government gained power. Hamas attacks often came in retaliation to Israeli military or Israeli civilian attacks on Palestinians. So one thing to remember is that even though the media here may not tell you about the deaths of Palestinians, and again, it is not to justify the suicide bombings, but you have to understand that nothing happens in a vacuum, right? And so as far as from Hamas's perspective, they were retaliating for Israel's violence against Palestinians. There was also a brutal massacre by Baruch Goldstein, who's a Kahanist, and some of the members of Netanyahu's cabinet right now are Kahanists, and they have openly stated they want ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, and they are official Israeli government officials. These are not just fringe groups. So think Trump on steroids. Baruch Goldstein in 1994 went into a mosque in Hebron and killed 29 Palestinians while they were praying. So that created a big uproar within the Muslim world, but got some coverage in the West, but not nearly as much as in other places. So with this form of resistance, Hamas's popularity grew. Again, it wasn't the only non-state actor. It wasn't the only political actor in the Palestinian scene, but it was seen as an organization that was willing to fight for the dignity of Palestinians and to resist the brutal occupation. And they grew and they started to receive millions of dollars a year in funding, mainly from donors abroad. And then they started to they increased their hybrid operations. Again, they started to govern and provide social services, but they also were a militant group or a terrorist group or an insurgency. Again, you can choose your words. Meanwhile, Yasser Arafat controlled the Palestinian Liberation, and so the organization, and there was a significant competition between the two. And in some ways, the PLO's transition from being more of a violent resistant group to a nonviolent created an opportunity for Hamas to step in and say, we'll fight violently, right? Because not everybody agrees on how to resist anytime you are an oppressed people. Some people believe you have to go Gandhi style, and some people believe you've got to go the Union style in the Civil War. So it depends on, everybody's got a different perspective, and Palestinians are no different. So you started to see a division among Palestinian leadership that actually has been around since the interwar period after the end of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. So according to an internal 97 Palestinian Authority investigation, Arafat had embezzled $300 million, a third of the PA's annual budget, and which could have been saved and was therefore wasted. So in a nutshell, Arafat became increasingly unpopular as a corrupt dictator who was working with Israel and working with the West to essentially subdue and co-opt the Palestinian resistance, and their lives were not getting better. Right? Settlements were growing, home demolitions were growing. I'll go into the details there, but you have the PLO and you have Hamas and other groups, and when the peaceful actors or the peaceful resistance or nonviolent resistance fails, it feeds the violent resistance, because the people ultimately are not seeing that the nonviolent path is getting them what they want. Ultimately, Arafat was accused of embezzling, again, tens of millions of dollars, and his associates were convicted, and he was notoriously an authoritarian. He wanted to have complete control over who represented Palestinians. He ultimately then died in 2004. Now, the Oslo agreements were supposed to be the peace that was going to end this cycle of violence, especially after the first Intifada. And it was solidified or finalized in 1993, right? The first Intifada is what created the pressure for negotiations. And I think this is something else to remember as a student, whether you like it or not. When you have asymmetrical power, asymmetrical conflict, if you were the party with less power, how do you get the other party to negotiate? How do you get the other party to make concessions or to change how they behave, especially if their behavior is repressive? And some actors historically have used violence as a means of negotiation. So just study the colonial era, the independence movements of the people from Africa and South America, Central America, and you'll understand, how did they get their independence? All of those people were terrorists to the French, to the British, to the US. It's all relative to where you sit. So this was the attempt, the peace deal. This was the attempt to resolve this peacefully. Notwithstanding that, after 93, this was the reality, at least in Gaza. The Israelis closed the borders for 17 days in 93, 64 days in 94. It means no one can come in or out. Nothing can come in or out except for very limited basic things. 84 days in 95, 90 days in 96, 57 days in 97, 14 days in 98, 7 days in 99. So throughout this post-Oslo time when things were supposed to be getting better, Gazans were under a full lockdown by Israel for more than 90 plus days. As a result, Gaza's economy experienced a deep recession in 95 and 96, when the incidence of closures was most intense, and again in late 2000, and unemployment would reach 70%, meaning people don't have an income. Closures blocked patients who required medical treatment. Students were blocked from Gaza who studied in the West Banks. And again, families could not even celebrate together. Now, I also have this infographic that gives you an idea. Again, I'm focusing primarily on Gaza, which is the introduction of the permit system in 91. So at this point, you couldn't get in or out of Gaza without the Israeli permit. Before then, it was a little bit it was more lax, but it was also less structured. First sweeping closures of Gaza started in 93, right after Oslo. Then the fences built in 94. Now remember, this is also at the time when you have the suicide bombings increasing. So with the suicide bombings comes the wall that essentially encloses the West Bank and also encloses Gaza, or parts of Gaza. In this case, it's a fence. Gaza's economy is largely severed from the West Bank in 96. The work permits and permits for family visits become rare in 98. Israeli forces impose more closures in 2000. And then, in 2000, Israeli forces destroy the seaport in Gaza. And in 2001, the Israeli military destroys the airport in Gaza. So Gaza has not had an airport since 2001. You cannot get in or out through an airplane. So all of this is collective punishment. Now, another way of control over the Palestinian Authority. So as of 93, the PLO, which had previously been the terrorists by Israeli perspective, by an Israeli, became the official representatives of Palestinians and then transitioned into the Palestinian Authority. However, they didn't have full autonomy. They didn't have a military. They couldn't control the borders. They couldn't control the skies. So they were really just delegated to do the dirty work of the Israelis, which caused them to lose significant credibility among Palestinians, because instead of an Israeli military officer that would arrest you, beat you, detain you, it was now a PA official, right? So they became the police. They did again, the dirty work. And if the Palestinian Authority didn't follow through on whatever Israel wanted on certain high profile issues, what Israel would do is it would withhold tax money, because Israel had control over the purse. Is each time there was any trade within or outside the West Bank or Gaza, there were tax revenues that were collected, and it would first go to Israel, and then Israel would distribute it to the Palestinian Authority. And that was how Arafat, that was where he got his money. And that was the money he also embezzled, but it was how he paid his staff and his employee and his police force. So in 97, following a wave of violent attacks, Israel began to withhold tax money collects on goods destined for Gaza or the West Bank. And that process has continued for 23 years. So do not fool yourself into thinking that the Palestinian Authority is independent. It absolutely is not independent. It's completely dependent on Israel, especially economically, because this is the only source of their revenue, unless they're going to get something from donors abroad, which is minimal. Even the $500 million that comes from America, that's peanuts compared to the budget. So Israel withheld funds from the Palestinian Authority in 2000, 2006, 2012, 2014, 2015, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. It is not an independent entity. It is effectively, the designated colonial power. This has left hundreds of thousands of Palestinian employees without salaries for months at a time, causing economic hardship, and it also caused anger against the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And Israel's justifications in the 1990s was because of Palestinian attacks on Israelis. So effectively, every time there was any violence against Israelis, whether there was Israelis were killed or injured by PA or Hamas or any group, because again, Yasser Arafat was expected to control all the Palestinians. This is one of the forms in which Israel would punish the PA. But here are some other ways in which, other things that the PA did that also caused Israelis to punish it and withhold money. So when Hamas won legislative elections in the occupied Palestinian territories in 2006, Israel withheld funds from the PA. That's not violent. That's peaceful. In 2012, the Palestinian Authority applied for statehood to the UN. Israel retaliated by withholding funds. That's not violent. That's peaceful. In 2015, because the Palestinians attempted to join the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Israel retaliated by withholding funds. So again, you're seeing a theme here, which is it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. And Israel holds all the cards. They're the strong nation state with the military. They're the ones who control the borders. They're the ones who control the airspace. They're the ones who control nearly everything. And yet, in the Western media, the expectation is that the Palestinians are supposed to fix the problem, that it's all the burden is on them. When in fact, they're not the ones the only thing that the Palestinians have, if you think that it's effective, is violence. But that's the only thing they have, if that is even effective to try to influence Israel. But any nonviolent attempts have really not made things any better for them, and arguably has actually made conditions much worse. Now, that's not to justify violence, that's just to explain that one of the things we need to do here is we need to figure out what's the long-term solution and who bears the burden of making the sacrifices, right? And is the status quo sustainable? Okay, so the second intifada then starts in 2000. So the Oslo agreements have failed. The Camp David agreements was in 2000. Clinton tried a last-ditch effort to try to bring back the peace deal. And then the second intifada hits. This is a very violent intifada. This is in contrast to the first intifada, which was mainly rock throwing, a tire burning, some Molotov cocktails. This was an intifada that involved suicide bombings, as well as nonviolent forms of resistance. And so, meanwhile, in the 90s, even before this intifada, the second intifada, Israel had continued to expand occupation infrastructure, settlements, land confiscations, home demolitions, administrative detentions, and Palestinian militants carried out violent attacks on Israeli civilians in cafes and buses throughout the 1990s. So you had this kind of back and forth cycle of violence. And Israelis and Palestinians believed, or some, not all, obviously, that their use of violence and force against the other was justified and would improve their negotiating position. Because all of this is really about trying to figure out what is the long-term solution? Do you have a two-state? Do you ethnically cleanse the Palestinians? Do you have a one state? Is it a one state that's all Jewish? And therefore you do ethnically cleanse the Palestinians? Is it a one state that's all Palestinian and you ethnically cleanse the Jews? Is it a one state where both are equal citizens in the country? What's the long-term, or is it just permanent occupation? And it's back and forth, violence, non-violence. It's not, as you can see, this hasn't been, it's not sustainable. The status quo is not sustainable. Ultimately, the Israeli policies of closures, lockdowns, permits, checkpoints shattered the Palestinian economy, increased poverty, and arguably made the situation fertile ground for recruitment for non-state actors who want to use violent resistance. So think about the long-term implications of what's happening right now. Think about if you live in Palestine and Gaza and 11,500 people have been murdered in 5 weeks, and many of these children are orphaned. What do you think, if these were Americans, what would be the long-term response? The second intifada triggers an escalation. So ultimately, this is just the beginning. This is what triggered it. Ariel Sharon, who was responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon during the Lebanese war, provocatively went to Al-Aqsa Mosque and intentionally was trying to provoke the Palestinians at a time when the situation was very tense. And he brought in a cadre of police and militia into the third holiest site in Islam, right after Mecca, Medina, and then Al-Aqsa, and effectively triggers a revolution. So it's kind of the same as bringing in the Hamas leader when they had turned violent, and bringing them to the Wailing Wall and with a bunch of Hamas militants and saying, we're here. That would be very provocative for many Orthodox Jews. And that's what Ariel Sharon did, because he could get away with it. And ultimately, in the beginning of the Intifada, which lasted 5 years, the Israeli military fired 1.3 million bullets in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's just in the first month. So it then launches its suppression of the uprising by shooting children in the head on the Temple Mount. About 10 days after the start of the Intifada, 14 Palestinian children had already been killed, and these cases were barely reported on in the Israeli media because all that was focused on were Jewish victims. Similarly in the Western media. So one of the problems, one of the difficulties in conducting analysis of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Palestine-Israel conflict, is you all do not have both sides of the story, right? You have one side, but you don't have the other side. And you've got, in order to understand the full picture, you have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And every time somebody tries to provide this perspective, unfortunately, they're called anti-Semitic, which is a form of censorship, as opposed to just letting people for themselves do their own analysis. Again, you don't have to agree. What I've done here is intentionally provide facts, which has extensive sources and research, and you can decide for yourself how to interpret those facts. All right, so ultimately the result of the second Intifada. For the first 3 years of the second Intifada, Israel destroyed more than 10% of Gaza, its agricultural land, and uprooted more than 226,000 trees. It ultimately morphed into a nightmare for Israel of exploding buses and suicide bombers. And for Palestinians, it meant years of brutal suppression, extensive bloodshed, sieges, closures, lockdowns, checkpoints, mass arrests, mass home demolitions, and also combat and sacrifices that achieved nothing. 3,000 Palestinians were killed, and 1,000 Israelis were killed between September 2000 and February 2005. So look at those casualty rates and compare them to the last 5 weeks, just to give you an idea of how severe the response has been by Israel. And 4,100 Palestinian homes were demolished, and some 16,000 Palestinians were arrested. Okay. So I ask you again, what would white Americans do if living under Israeli occupation since 1967 of what I've just described? Because what you're always asked is, what would you do if you were in the Israeli position? But there are two parties, and you have to ask yourself both sides. And again, I'm privileging whiteness because whiteness is privileged in this country. Not that I agree with that, but that's just the reality we live in. So Hamas then rises to power. Now, something really strange happens. From 88, right, August of 88 until 2006, Hamas's modus operandi is twofold. Violence through suicide bombings and through other forms of militant activity, rocket launches from Gaza, etc. But also governance, the social services. And then, interestingly, they switch course and say, we want to run for elections in the West Bank and Gaza, because one of the positive outcomes of the Oslo Agreement is that the Palestinian Authority created legislative and executive branches. And therefore, you had Palestinian legislative elections, which would be kind of the parliament, right? And Hamas, and remember, at this point, Yasser Arafat is dead in 2004. And the Palestinian Authority's reputation is in shambles. So Hamas steps in and says, we're going to run. And this is a factual statement, not an opinion. Multiple international organizations that monitor elections found that Hamas won those elections fairly. And it was nonviolent. And Hamas was ready to govern. And they're like, okay, we're going to now govern. We won the elections. They're a designated terrorist group in the US and in Europe. They're also considered a terrorist group by Israel. So the rule of thumb when it comes to democracy, and you need to know this as an American student, is that your country and your government only supports democracy abroad when the people that they want to win. When the people they don't want to win, those people don't have a right to democracy. Just remember that. So they win, but they are not accepted by Israel, the US, and most certainly not by the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority saw this as an opportunity to undermine their opposition. And Fatah, who was now the PLO, the successor to the PLO, refuses to cede power, and they have a civil war, and the Fatah and Hamas kicks Fatah out of Gaza. So from 2007 onward, there is no Palestinian Authority, there is no Fatah. It's all Hamas that's governing and ruling inside, while Israel is completely controlling the boundaries, and Fatah only, and so Mahmoud Abbas, right, they only control the West Bank. All right. Now, this is another opportunity where you go, well, could Hamas have been transitioned from a militia group or a hybrid group to adopting nonviolence? If you ask the Israeli government, they'll say absolutely not. They're irredeemable, they're hateful, they're evil, if you ask the American government. But let's look at some of the facts, because one of the things you have to do if you're trying to figure out solutions to very complex problems is you've got to think outside the box. And if you think in black and white, then you're never ever going to get anywhere. And co-optation is sometimes a strategy, is can you get people who were using violence to put down their guns and essentially become integrated into a nonviolent governance structure. So in 2006, 2007, and 2008, top leaders of Hamas went publicly on international news and said, look, we're willing to essentially discard what we have in our charter, which is very stridently anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli, and go consider the 1967 borders. So here are some of the statements that were made. Ismail Haniyeh in The Guardian in 2006 says, we, Hamas, are for peace and want to put an end to bloodshed. Peaceful means will do if the world is willing to engage in a constructive and fair process in which we and the Israelis are treated as equals. In 2007, Khalid Mashal says, Hamas has changed a lot and great efforts have been made to conform with the realistic positions of Palestinians and Arabs, wherein Hamas says with other Palestinian forces that we demand for a Palestinian country as the border was back in 1967. That's a major concession by Hamas. And isn't this a development change? And then finally, in 2008, Khalid Mashal states, we agree to a Palestinian state on pre-67 borders with Jerusalem as its capital, with genuine sovereignty without settlements, but without recognizing Israel. However, we have offered a truce if Israel withdraws to the 67 borders, a truce of 10 years as a proof of recognition. Again, now you can look at that and go, they're lying. You can look at that and say, I don't believe them. Or you can look at that and say, is this an opportunity for us to negotiate and to perhaps transition Hamas, which is the de facto government, which is running the Gaza with Israeli permission and approval, because the Israelis had pulled out of Gaza in 2005 under Ariel Sharon as the prime minister. Now, the other thing that's really important if you study colonialism and post-colonialism is that colonial countries or occupation countries who are colonizing a particular, occupying a particular land and people, they play games. They're not always forthright in how their relationships are with the people that they vilify or the organizations. And just like In the 1980s, our US government funded Osama bin Laden and funded the Mujahideen and funded all of those freedom fighters that fought the Soviet Union because we needed those Muslims to fight the atheist communists. And if you read my book, The Racial Muslim, I talk about how political Islamists were actually allies of the United States during the Cold War, because political Islamists don't like atheists, and communists were atheists. But of course, once the Cold War is over and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda decide that, no, we're not going to listen to it, we have a different political agenda, they become terrorists. Well, the same thing happens with Hamas as well, because the PLO, which was the most dominant popular group from around 64 until arguably the first Intifada, when Hamas comes on the scene as a political competitor, Israel funded Hamas in the 1980s and actually saw it as a counterbalance to what it deemed the more radically political PLO. However, once Hamas started using violence to oppose the Israeli occupation, then they became the persona non grata, and the PLO becomes the favored party. So that is a very common switch that happens when you have these asymmetrical relationships between the occupier, occupied, the colonizer, the colonized. It's not unique just to Palestine, Israel. And this is what makes Palestine so unusual, is that what you're seeing here is somewhat anachronistic. These are the realities that existed in Africa and in Central America and South America during the colonial era. And so while all the other countries have become independent, Palestine is still in the state of occupation/colonization. So for many decades, Israel tried intentionally to drive a wedge between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinians are a much less formidable challenge if they are divided. And in fact, high-ranking Israeli officials have stated openly that the Palestinian Authority is a liability and Hamas is an asset, because it's much easier to get the US support and European support when Hamas is a terrorist group in trying to divert attention from the occupation. So if I can get you just to focus on the violence of Hamas, then you don't focus on the occupation's violence against Palestinians. Right? So there's a diversionary tactic there that is not, how do we actually resolve the dispute? So in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdraws from Gaza, it withdraws 6,000 settlers, some of whom were very violent towards the Israeli state because they didn't want to leave. And it allowed itself to present itself to uncritical audiences as, look, we made painful sacrifices as Israel. We are returning Gaza to the Palestinians. We're good faith actors. But in fact, Israel controlled everything and continues to control everything. Gaza's population registry, airspace, coastal waters, 6 out of 7 Gaza's land borders, and Gaza remained dependent on Israel for water, electricity, internet, and telecommunications. And the reason I highlighted Gaza's population registry is because you'll remember that our president shamelessly engaged in misinformation and claiming that the numbers that were coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry of the deaths of Palestinians were not accurate, which was about as cruel and brutal as one can imagine. But the reason why it was misinformation is because, do you know how the Gaza Health Ministry knows who's dead and who isn't? Because every single Palestinian has a registration number that is given by the Israeli government. They control the population registry. And that's why then they issued the 20-page list of everybody's name that had been killed with their registration number that's granted by the State of Israel. The Israeli military regularly invades Gaza with soldiers, shoots anyone who approaches the border, and drops sonic bombs and missiles on civilian areas that result in the death of innocent civilians. Again, all this is way before October 7th. So people call it an open-air prison. Why? Well, because all movement of people and goods is restricted by Israel. So 40% of Gaza's population live in poverty, most of them in extreme poverty. 80% of households depend on food aid. So when the humanitarian aid was completely blocked from October 7th to October 22nd, 70% of people were already, that's all they depended on, is these trucks that come in through Rafah border. And since the 22nd, a fraction, it's between 1 to 5% of the daily need. So 500 trucks of humanitarian aid go into Gaza every day before October 7th, just to meet the basic needs of Gazans because they're completely dependent due to their poverty. After October 7th, you had 20 trucks come in, then it went to 40, and then it went to 100. I don't know what the number is now, but it's not 500. 500 is just to meet the daily needs. Plus, there's no water. So in addition to the 11,500 plus people who have been killed by bombardments, you have tens of thousands that are going to die from starvation and dehydration. That's the genocidal policy. Death by starvation and dehydration of over 2.3 million civilians, in addition to carpet bombing of residential areas, is genocidal, right? Okay, so the consensus has been that the blockade has inflicted disproportionate damage upon the civilian population in Gaza, and that the Israeli blockade was a desire to punish the people of Gaza Strip for having elected Hamas. This is just to give you an idea of the movements, and I'm almost done, so I only have a few slides left, that very few people can come in or out. So people that are under the age of 16 have never left Gaza, right? They've restricted access within 300 meters of the Gaza side of the perimeter fence with Israel. So if you even get close to the fence, you get shot. And Israeli snipers are the best, arguably, in the world. They kneecap Palestinians and they intentionally kill them, shoot them in ways that will paralyze them. And these are studies that have been done. And it is an intentional policy, which is to paralyze young men, especially those who are engaged in nonviolent resistance, because the ones engaged in violent resistance, they just kill them. So in the past year, this is just to give you an idea of the dependency of Gazans and Palestinians on the Israeli economy. So the Palestinians are very helpful, useful in being a form of cheap labor for Israelis. And ultimately, the objective is, if we can't get rid of you and get you to go to Egypt, which I think is ultimately the end game of many people in the Israeli government right now, is to push the Palestinians as close to the Rafah border as possible and try to make a deal with the Egyptians and get the Palestinians out of Gaza and put them in Egypt. And ultimately just retake Gaza as part of Israel. So the unemployment rate, again, is very high. Youth unemployment is 75%. And so if you're unemployed and you're young and you are trapped and you can't leave, what do you do with yourself? I don't know. I have a lot of young people here. What would you do if those were your circumstances? Similarly, since 2006, again, as a form of collective punishment, Israel's prevented restoration of Gaza's only power plant, impeded infrastructure repairs and upgrades, forced Gaza authorities to purchase only Israeli fuel, and the plant operates at a fraction of its capacity because of an inability to import enough fuel and parts owing to the Israeli blockade. And this was before the complete prohibition of fuel and electricity after October 7th. Before October 7th, right? This is Gaza residents experience rolling blackouts from 12 to 15 hours per day. And the plant, the one electricity plant that Gaza had, only met 50% of Gaza's needs. And these are all manufactured problems. This does not have to be the case. And the electricity crisis worsens the water crisis because the water, fresh water, comes from two sources: from the sea that's being desalinated, water from desalinated, or pumped up from the ground, which requires electricity. So when Israel cut off electricity after October 7th, it effectively forced Gazans or Palestinians in Gaza to do what they're doing now, which is to drink dirty water. And dirty water produces diseases, and 26% of diseases in Gaza before October 7th were caused by drinking dirty water. You also have raw sewage that cannot operate normally due to the blockade and electricity shortages. So there's an enormous amount of pollution in the Mediterranean Sea. Septic tanks overflow, sewage mixes with rain, flooding streets and homes, and rancid smell attracts flies and keeps kids from playing outside and mothers from opening their windows. Okay. Just to quickly go back to the fishing sector, so the very small fishing sector that's left is having to, the fishermen get shot if they get too close to the Israeli, whatever the Israeli set as the border for fishing, and there's no accountability, right? There's no court you can go to. There's no police you can go report to. If you get shot, you get shot. So you have to just try to avoid that. Public health is also, and now right now we have been seeing how the Israelis have bombed hospitals. Shifa hospital is completely out of service. Al-Quds is completely out of service. Shifa was the largest hospital in Gaza. It was already struggling with power and electricity shortages before October 7th. And as a result, many people could not get the vital health care that they needed. But now that hospital has been bombed. And actually, last I read today, I believe there's a few hundred doctors that are trapped in a Shifa and a few hundred patients that are trapped. They took all the ICU patients have died because of there's no electricity at all. There hasn't been electricity at Shifa Hospital. And there are 39 babies that were premature. 3 of them have been confirmed dead, and perhaps it's increased. So it's cruel. It's cruel. There is absolutely not even, for example, we'll give you an hour or 5 hours to get out, any kind of humanitarian escape. Their lives don't matter. Mental health has been understandably and predictably very bad in the Gaza Strip. The number of children that report feeling fearful has increased just from 2018 to 2022. You have 84% of them. You have 80% of children feel nervous. 77% of children feel depressed. 78% of children were grieving in 2022. Because remember, there were multiple attacks on Gaza from Israel over the last 6 years. More than half of Gaza's children have contemplated suicide, and 3 out of 5 are self-harming, which is the highest rate in the world. And 71% of the adult population in Gaza screens positive for depression. And this just gives you an idea of the massive food insecurity that Gazans or Palestinians have experienced in Gaza. And as a result, they were already struggling with malnutrition and insufficient food. So I'll ask you again, after everything I've been telling you, what would white Americans do if they were living under an Israeli blockade since 2007 in these conditions? What would you guys do? And if you decided that you wanted to resist in any form, and somebody criticized you and called you the bad person and called you the perpetrator, the evil person, how would you respond to those criticisms? And would you even take seriously anybody who completely discredited your experiences and pretended as if none of what you've experienced matters? And the only thing that matters is what the Israelis have experienced. So this is effectively what Palestinians in Gaza have experienced in 2008. Israel has launched attacks in Gaza 4 times. And in 2008, 2009, it lasted 23 days. In 2012, it lasted 8 days. In 2014, it lasted 50 days. And in 2021, it lasted 11 days. Now, each time, these were attacks that were in response to Hamas launching rockets into Israel. Now, there is a policy that has been around since the founding of Israel in 1948, which is called Ben-Gurionism. And it came from their first prime minister. Ben-Gurionism is the policy of disproportionate response. And it is official Israeli policy that if the Palestinians kill one of us, we must kill exponentially more of them. If they injure one of us, we must injure exponentially more of them. This is the official policy, which means it has absolutely no regard for international law, which requires proportionality, distinction, and a prohibition of collective punishment. So again, none of this is new, that Israel has been accused of war crimes, but so has Hamas. The difference is that you have been told Hamas commits war crimes, but have you been told that Israel commits war crimes? And how do we stop these war crimes from both sides? This was Operation Cast Lead from 2009 to 2008, when Israel used white phosphorus munitions, which is prohibited under international law, and it's using it again right now. And multiple investigations by third parties have found that in a vast majority of these bombings, they could not find a military target. It was just collective punishment. Also, that Israel targets critical infrastructure, flour mills, cement factories, again, as a way to bring the Gazans back into poverty. They've destroyed mosques, they've targeted churches, and in 2008 and 2009, 4 Israelis civilians were killed by Hamas, and 1,400 Palestinians were killed by Israelis. So this is a common theme, and it's an intentional policy. We must kill them into submission. We must make them we must kill as many people as possible. And this is essentially forceful submission. So it's a very violent occupation. Operation Pillar of Defense, Israel's assassination of Hamas's military chief Ahmed Jabari, who was about to sign a permanent ceasefire with Israel, triggered rocket fire from Hamas. And then 8-day offensive, 171 Palestinians were killed, 60% of them were civilians, 35 of the civilian victims were children, 14 of the civilian victims were women. The total number of people wounded was 648. So look at these numbers compared to the numbers today when we're at 11,500, almost 12,000 civilians killed. Hamas fired 1,500 rockets at Israel, killing 4 Israeli civilians, wounding at least 38, and in what Human Rights Watch also described as war crimes. But I want to just tell you, this guy was about to sign a ceasefire. So there have been multiple moments where Hamas probably rationally realized we're an asymmetrical power. We can't fight the Israeli military permanently. This is really about negotiation. But the question is, does Israel really want that? Does Israel actually want a Palestinian state? And most analysts, based on what they've been doing in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas. So look at what's happening in the West Bank, and that takes out the variable of Hamas. And then ask yourself, has Israel been engaging in good faith action? Has it been shrinking its settlements? Has it been providing more autonomy to the Palestinians? Has it been doing everything it can to create a sustainable Palestinian state? The facts show no. These are just facts, they're not opinions. 2014 was the longest and most destructive attack on Gaza. Israel killed more than 1,500 Gazan civilians, including 550 children. It injured 10,000 civilians and destroyed 18,000 homes and left behind 2.5 million tons of rubble. It launched 6,000 airstrikes on Gaza, mostly on residential buildings. And when the UN investigated 15 of those strikes, it concluded that at least 6 of them, there was little or no information available to explain why residential buildings were being targeted. Hamas killed 6 Israeli civilians in rocket and mortar attacks and fired indiscriminately into Israel, which are also war crimes. 2018 and 2019, tens of thousands. Now, this is really important. This was the first non-violent form of resistance by grassroots Palestinians since the first Intifada. The March of Return was not led by Hamas. The March of Return was led by young Gazans, Palestinians, who had been trapped and were they wanted out. And they wanted, they say we want to return to our homeland, but ultimately what they want is they want their own state. And they descended along the border, they threw rocks, but they had no weapons. And again, it was not led by Hamas. And what did Israel do? It responded with lethal force. It killed 223 Palestinians. It hit 8,079 Palestinians with live fire, shrapnel, or tear gas canisters. It also shot 6,106 Palestinians with snipers leading to life-changing wounds. There's a great book by Jasbir Kwar that talks about this maiming policy. It was an intentional maiming. The snipers were told to maim them, to not kill them, but to shoot them in the kneecap and in the back so that they would be permanently paralyzed. But none of this you heard about in the Western media. So in that particular march, in the March of Return, not a single Israeli experienced any major physical harm. So again, violence doesn't work. Non-violence doesn't work. What would you do if you were Palestinian? And finally, the last one, which was 2021, was triggered. So this is where events in the West Bank caused Hamas to lob rockets into Israel. And then you had another round of disproportionate response by Israel. At this point, Israel was trying to uproot 58 Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. So if you guys know Mohammed al-Kurd, who is now in the US and has become, he's a journalist and has a large following. One of his houses and his twin sister's house was demolished, and he was one of the people that was featured, I believe, in Time magazine. And all of his resistance was nonviolent, but it was not successful. Palestinians headed to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the holiest night of Ramadan. They were forced off buses and made to finish the journey on foot. Israelis attacked Palestinians at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. Israelis police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, shooting rounds of stun grenades and tear gas at worshippers. And then Hamas fires rockets into Israel, and Israel begins its aerial assault on Gaza, and the cycle continues of disproportionately violent response and collective punishment. At the height of it, 113 Palestinians were internally displaced. 8,250 still were displaced as of October 7th. Israel killed 261 Palestinians, including 67 children, wounded 2,200 Palestinians. Palestinians or Hamas killed 14 Israelis. Okay, so we will, this is, again, I could just keep going. The last final thing I'll just remind you of is the reason why the only news sources you're getting from Gaza are Gazans or Palestinians, because since 2006, Israel has either completely barred foreign journalists or has severely limited it because they don't want you to know what's going on there. Unfortunately, the smartphone has been a problem for many of the authoritarian states in the world, whether it's from the Arab Spring or from the Israeli occupation. And also, intentional spreading of misinformation is a common and well-researched military tactic by the Israelis. This is my final slide. That's the death. These are the numbers before 2007. You can find this, these are UN numbers. So you can see the disproportionate number of deaths or murders of Palestinian versus murders of Israelis. And that is the modus operandi of Israel. It's been that way since 48. And international law is intended for that not to be the case, regardless, even if you flipped it, right? All right, so I will end with some resources. We have a bibliography. So if you go to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, go under resources. We've got academic resources, multimedia. It's not all on Palestine because our center focuses on Muslim, Arab, South Asian, civil and human rights. But under the transnational rights and security heading, you'll find things that are on Palestine as well as other international topics. But these are some books that have that are specific to Gaza. And this presentation is also available if you go to our YouTube channel. So if you go to Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights on YouTube, we have a Gaza teach-in, which is effectively these slides. So you can watch it again or share it, and we have these resources there. I highly recommend Gaza Fights for Freedom. That is a documentary that is about the March of Return, the non-violent resistance of 2018, 2019, and kind of gives you that detail of, because what you need to know is how Palestinians have attempted to non-violently resist and how that has failed. And if non-violent resistance fails, then you're guaranteeing violent resistance. And if violent resistance fails and nonviolent resistance fails, then you're just supporting permanent oppression with $3.4 billion a year of your money. And again, we give Hamas zero, which we should give them zero. Netflix also has some. These are some sources that provide you the perspective of Palestinians or Israelis who are either anti-Zionist, or at least their definition of Zionism does not include the permanent oppression of Palestinians. 972 Magazine, Palestine, Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, Al Jazeera, Shabaka, and Democracy Now! These are civil society organizations. Some of these are actually based in Israel, like Beit Salam, Adala, Al-Haq, and Gisha. And then you have Foundation for Middle East Peace and Adamir. So all of these have resources, they have facts. So this is where you can go and research and prove me wrong. Because that's what we do in universities. Prove me wrong. Debate me on the merits. This is really important for those of you who are here, is make sure that you are reporting Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, because it's not getting reported. And a lot of people are experiencing it. And the reason why I think it's important is because most of the university presidents across the country have only humanized the Jewish-Israeli perspective. And they have recognized the importance of combating anti-Semitism, as they should, but they have not talked about Islamophobia. They have not talked about anti-Palestinian racism. And they have not recognized that they have Arab and Palestinian and Muslim students who pay tuition, who are alumni, who are professors, and who are equals. So the one-sidedness that's in the foreign media is in your universities. It's across the country. And the reason I will just tell you is because your university presidents don't work for you. They're CEOs for a corporation, and they work for their stakeholders. And their stakeholders are donors and the board of governors. So you are not somebody they care about. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, unless you're able to engage in collective action and withhold your tuition money at tens of thousands or thousands of students. And then they're going to listen to you. But until then, they don't care about you. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. And I say that as a tenured faculty member. And that's why the faculty are your allies, not the university administrators. So you can report it to the University of Michigan Dean of Students. There's a campus climate concern report. You can report it to the Department of Public Safety. Volunteer for CARE Michigan or American Anti-Discrimination Committee. They are being inundated with reports of hate incidents across the country. Please, 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 this is really important. You don't think it matters, but it does. Each of you today, before you leave, go to this site, or you can, there's another site for Jewish Voice for Peace, and it literally, you just put your information and you press call or email, and it goes straight to your elected officials. And it has the email all set up for you. It has the number all set up for you. But if every one of us calls every day, at the very least, our elected officials know that the special interest groups and the lobbyists don't represent their constituencies. Join a protest or rally. Oh, yes. Thank you. Actually, thank you. I actually made it easy. Thank you, Professor Cole. Maybe we can pass these out. Do you want to pass these out for me? Would you mind? What? Would you pass these out for me? Write an op-ed. You guys are you're being trained to be intellectuals, thinkers, writers. If you're afraid that you'll get retaliated against, write under a pseudonym. Because retaliation is real, I get it. If you're a white American, you should write with your real name. Because if you're a Muslim and you're Arab and you're Palestinian, you're the one that's going to get retaliated against. And unfortunately, there's no one there to defend you. So this is an opportunity for people to use their white privilege, their white male privilege. We just came out with a report, which I highly recommend you read, called Presumptively Anti-Semitic Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, which is at our website. And then finally, this is really important because I know this presentation is depressing and it's frustrating and it makes you feel powerless, but it shouldn't. It should make you feel powerful because you live in the empire and therefore you actually have some influence in contrast to people who live in other countries. But don't misdirect your anger, your sadness, or your frustration at each other. And don't misdirect it at innocent people. Even if, and don't misdirect it at people who disagree with you, right? There are going to be people who disagree with you. And sometimes you just walk away and say, peace be upon you, right? You don't have to convince everybody to agree with you on everything. And then I'll just leave this up while we do Q&A. These are some of the social media influencers that are, that you can follow if you want, again, the Palestinian perspective. Okay, we do have some time for Q&A. Sorry, I went on a little. Okay, why don't we take from the audience first? Yes.
That Hamas is taking hostages in an attempt to hostage trade, fairly doesn't Israel has. Do you believe that's accurate, or is any information you know of that can shed light on that?
Can you repeat this
Yeah.
question because they won't be able to hear it?
So you asked that the objective of Hamas in taking, I think they have 230 or 239 Israelis that are hostages. Some of them, the majority of them are civilians, but some of them are military, police, military soldiers. And whether their intent is to negotiate a trade. I think that is a plausible theory. So there are multiple, I mean, I don't know for fact. So let me just kind of give you my educated guess, is that they took those hostages as negotiating leverage for multiple purposes, some of which have not been successful and may never be successful, right? So one would be perhaps to deter Israel from doing what it has done, which is kill tens of thousands of Palestinians and engage in disproportionate violence and collective punishment against Palestinian civilians. And that perhaps Israel's concern with the lives of those hostages, not knowing where they are, that by bombing them, maybe they would kill the hostages too, and that the pressure from the families of the hostages and from the Israeli public would cause the Israeli government to negotiate rather than to just conduct scorched earth. So if that was a strategy, that has not worked in that regard. The second strategy is ultimately a negotiation to either get a ceasefire or a negotiation to do a swap, because I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a few thousand Palestinians that are in jail. And I suspect the Hamas is more concerned with the people that are associated with Hamas, right? Their members, not just all Palestinians. And that would be, there would be a quote unquote prisoner hostage swap. That's to be determined, because lately the families of the hostages and other members of the public have started to pressure Netanyahu and say, whatever you're doing, the scorched earth policy is not working. We want our family members back. And this isn't working. How many more Palestinians you're going to keep killing? And you're killing civilians and you're not getting our family members back. And ultimately that's what we want. In addition to, some of them may not support, right, the violence that Israel is conducting. And then the other may be to negotiate a longer term solution. But if there's one thing that the Israelis have made clear since 48, is they don't compromise. They don't compromise. I mean, even the Oslo Agreement was unusual, but if you, there's a lot of critics of the Oslo Agreement, including Edward Said and others who said it was a trick. And if in hindsight, it was a trick. It was a trick insofar as the Palestinians were worse off than they were. In other words, they didn't get the state. They got more settlements in the West Bank. They got, they were treated worse in Gaza. So to be determined. But there is one thing that is strange, is as they're bombing, there's a likelihood that they're bombing places where the hostages are. And so I would be very surprised if all those hostages are still alive. I would be very surprised that at least a few of them just didn't die from the bombings, as opposed to being intentionally killed by Hamas. But the only actors that can influence Israel is the United States government and the Israeli public. In my opinion. I said the Israeli public, the US government and the Israeli public. It's fine. Hello, Professor.
Narrative is everything, right? And so one of the biggest challenges the U.S. public in particular is this narrative. And something that you said earlier when I got here struck me, right? This idea of sort of the violence that created that in America, right? And the idea that, liberal democracy, secular violence is a part of how they function. It's not like, sort of the narrative is we're law and all that kind of stuff. The reality is violence is central to how all of these things function. And so I'm wondering if there's any way or any purchase in kind of that reality being part of the narrative from trying to teach or trying to change, trying to help people understand what's happening, or is that kind of a lost cause because it's so, I don't know, nuanced maybe, right? That you're wasting your time trying to get people to recognize what they actually happening, where they actually are and how they actually operate. That's the question.
Yeah, so tell me if I got this right, but that violence is an integral part of the creation and establishment and maintenance of liberal states. And then in fact, violence or state violence is not as illiberal as we are taught to believe, but it just takes different forms. Because the one thing that makes Israel unique in it claiming that it is a liberal state. So my position, and this is my analytical position, is that Israel is not a democracy for non-Jews. Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship are at best third-class citizens. Many of them right now are being arrested in Israel. I have friends who are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and they are so scared. They can't even like anything on Facebook or in social media. They can't, everything is being monitored to the extent that I was told by a few of them, don't send me anything. Anything you send me is being monitored. So just receiving stuff. So that made me think, oh, that sounds like an Arab dictatorship to me, right? And there's plenty of literature about how Arab, Palestinian with Israeli citizenship have been discriminated in housing, education, employment, right? A lot of, I don't want to be I don't want to be comparative in a way that's not appropriate, but I think perhaps just for ease of reference, is similar to racial minorities in the US and perhaps even worse. But so even though they do have citizenship, but when it comes to the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, the violence is blatant. It's blatant. And that's why I find it, well, I think the interesting question when it comes to liberalism and democracy in Israel is how the United States and how the West is so accepting of this illusion that you can be a democratic state, but only for a particular religious group in your state and still be considered liberal and democratic. And we're just going to forget about the 6 million people that you're occupying in a very violent way, and still acknowledge that you're a liberal state. But I think we know that that is a politically expedient position, because much of, if you look at the history of Israel-US relations, is that Israel is, one, it was a client state in the Cold War, right? So it was useful in that context. Two, many of the elites have strong relationships with the elites in the US and the elites in Europe, which affects the transnational relations. And then three, it still plays a useful function in US imperial building in the Middle East, right? Even post Cold War. So much of it is, a lot of this liberalism talk and democracy talk is just state propaganda for all of you. To make you believe that your country is exceptional, to make you believe that your country does no harm, to make you believe that you can go to sleep at night and not worry that your taxpayer money is used to engage in violence, both against whether it's Black people, Black bodies, immigrant bodies, right, Muslim bodies in America, or Palestinian bodies abroad or other places. And I think this is where the Black Lives Matter movement was just so instrumental for your generation in kind of hopefully providing a sense of social awareness to look at your country with a more lucid eye, that, as Professor Abdulkader said, that it's liberal states can be very violent, especially for certain people or certain groups of people. But I mean, I don't know if the implicit question is, but I intentionally do teach-ins to try to just bring the facts, because I think the facts speak for themselves and show that the dominant narrative is false. It's just because you haven't been exposed to these facts. But I think when you're exposed to them, you realize, I mean, I've had people say, I'm surprised that the Palestinians haven't been violently resisting since 1967, right? Some people may look at that and go, they're some of the most nonviolent people I've ever met, based on those circumstances, which is why I always ask you, what would a white American do, right, in those circumstances? Other questions? I guess we have some people. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this. So I'm not sure how many. Oh, that's an interesting question. So is Israel a white colonial power, and this is all a form of white supremacy? How can you advocate for Palestine without alienating Jews? That's a great question. So I think the first thing that's important is it's, in my opinion, okay, so I'm gonna, again, always preface when it's my analysis. I think it's quite anti-Semitic to homogenize Jewish people, just like it is Islamophobic to hegemonize Muslims. There are, as we've seen with Jews for Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, right? As we've seen with If Not Now, as we've seen with Rabbis for Peace, there are a critical number of Jewish Americans, Jewish Europeans, Jewish Israelis who do not agree with Israeli state practices and policies, just like there are a lot of Americans who don't agree with American state practices and policies, just like there were Americans who went and protested the war in Iraq and who believe that this is a fundamentally anti-Black racist state and anti-Native American settler colonial state. So I think that's important to just acknowledge. And that's why I started out. And part of the Israeli propaganda is to make you believe that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't Jews who absolutely support whatever Israel does. And I'm not going to speak for them, because all you have to do is go look at what ADL says about Israel, look at what AIPAC, American Israeli Political Action Committee, says about Israel. I mean, it is the kind of unconditional knee-jerk support for Israel, at least based on my analysis, is the majority, seems to be the majority perspective of Jewish Americans, especially those that are may arguably above the age of 35. You're seeing a major change in the younger Jewish American community, and some of you, may be experiencing that here on campus. And so, having said that, then you have to ask yourself, how do you ally cross-racially and cross-religious identities for common principles, right? And I mean, that's what the two-state solution was supposed to do. Before October 7th, there had been an uptick, and it was a noticeable uptick among what we'll call centrist Jewish American elites and Jewish Israeli elites, not calling for, but entertaining a one-state solution. Because the two-state solution had just become so clearly impossible because of Israel's decisions, because it controls the land. Israel has all the cards. The only cards, so to speak, as a metaphor, that the Palestinians have is violence that is what I just described, right? Lobbying, rockets, throwing stones, suicide bombings in the 90s, but it's very, in the grand scheme of things, it's very weak. And it's nothing like a military occupation as we've seen in 5 weeks, 12,000 people dead, right? So that was starting to be entertained, which is maybe we just need one state and we have a confederation or we have an autonomous region, or, you know, just to start thinking about that, because how in the world are we going to get 2 states? Because what are we going to do with those 1 million+ settlers, Israeli settlers in the West Bank? And how can we ever have Gaza and the West Bank be one country if Hamas and Fatah are fighting, and if Hamas is completely ostracized and, you know, like a no-go in terms of any diplomatic ties with Israel? So things were quite untenable. So I guess, I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily answering that question, but I do think, and this, you know, there's a debate on this, but I think the facts are clear to me that Israel is a settler colonial country, to the extent that the majority of people who created the state of Israel came from Europe. And to the extent that those people from Europe came with the purpose of removing the indigenous population, or killing them, or ethnically cleanse them, or forcibly displacing them, to create a state for them. That included, yes, what we call the Mizrahi Jews who were in Palestine, who had been there for centuries, but not for the Palestinians, who at that point, I think, had reached over 1 million, right, in 1948, and 750,000 of them had been forcibly displaced. So that's settler colonialism. And America is also a settler and colonial country. And all of us are beneficiaries of it unless you're Native American. But the question becomes, and this is where, you know, the argument that kind of mixes with theology is it legitimate for a group of people who claim that it was their land centuries ago, based on religious beliefs, to then come back and say, okay, everybody out? Because if that's the case, then all of us need to pack up and get out of here, because it doesn't belong to us, the Native Americans. It belongs to them. And it's time to go home from where you came from. Whether you came voluntarily or you were forcibly brought here on slave ships, right? Or your ancestors were. And if that's the case, you got to be consistent. But from the Palestinian perspective, you can't, people cannot just come and decide that because thousands of years ago, their people dominated or controlled the land, that now whoever is here can't be here anymore. That's textbook settler colonialism. That's not anti-Semitic. It could have been Muslims that did it. It could have been Hindus that did it. I mean, pick your religion. And this is another myth, is that Israeli propaganda wants you to believe that this is a religious dispute, not a land dispute. It's a land dispute. It's about the land and who gets to live there in dignity and equality and be part of a nation state, because that's essentially the form of governance that's dominant right now, post-World War II, post-Ottoman Empire. And most of the forms of anti-Semitism that you all are familiar with is European. It's European. The way that it was manifested, the way that it was articulated, the way that it was acted on is European. The experiences of Jews in the Muslim Middle East and the Muslim majority countries is totally different than the experience of Jews in Europe. That doesn't mean that it was perfect, but it was completely different. And I think it's important for you to educate yourself, if you're interested in the history of Jewish people, to not compare what happened in Eastern Europe with what compared to happen in Egypt or Morocco or Iraq or Iran at the same period. You can't talk about 1967 or 1955 Egypt and compare it to 1800, right, Egypt or Europe. You can't be anachronistic. You got to compare the same period and era. Anybody else have a question in person? Yes. Well, hold on. Let me just spread it out. You asked a question. Anybody else have a question in the room? No? If universities are doing one-sided views and they respond to the money that control them, is it reasonable that students ask for divestment away from funding in military war complex? I think students can do whatever they want as long as it's legal. The question is it feasible? I think so I'm not going to talk about divestment per se. I have my views on what's effective and what's not effective, but I do think the broader issue, and you guys are learning this, is that what is the role of the university, right? And why are universities, are they here simply as cash cows and you're simply a customer and you're no different than the Verizon customer and the, I don't know, the McDonald's customer and the Starbucks customer, or are you something different? Is your relationship different? Because if it is just mainly a customer service, customer vendor relationship, you shouldn't expect a deeply intellectual benefit. And this whole obsession with being comfortable all the time, and feeling safe all the time, and feeling heard all the time, that's just neoliberal capitalism, which is all, how can I serve you so that I can make money off of you? As opposed to, how can I make you think? How can I make you challenge the assumptions that you brought with you? How can I expose you to different ideas? And how can I teach you how to disagree based on the facts and teach you how to do research? And yes, it's going to make you uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable in a way where you physically feel threatened, but uncomfortable in a way where you go, my parents lied to me all that time, right? Or I was reading this and I never read that. That's okay, right? So I think that students have look, I think students need to be more engaged. And collective action is good training for being an engaged civic citizen. But what you are learning is that your universities are not neutral, impartial entities when it comes to certain ideas, for better or worse. Yes.
Organizers trying to engage with practice, organized practice, most often those that are willing to engage at practice level, and those that are really connected to, in the case Palestine or in the conflict cities, generally we would maybe recommend trying to organize practice around the maybe university or university, the tenure level. What works, what doesn't work.
It's a good question. So I actually wrote a piece about a broader structural issue that, again, is independent of the Palestine-Israel issue, but it certainly is impacted by it. You guys remember the Hamline University controversy? This was when a adjunct arts history professor in an online class had shown a photo, or excuse me, an art, a painting from the Persian era of, I'm not an art historian, so I'm going to say this wrong, but a few hundred years ago, that included a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it was an authentic picture from centuries ago, and it was considered a classic in Persian Muslim art. And so one of the Muslim students was deeply, deeply offended and effectively, complained, and it became a big national controversy. So you can read my op-ed on Al Jazeera. But what that issue brought up, among many things, was how the adjunctification of the university is very intentional and part of this whole neoliberal capitalist structure where the number of tenured professors today in every department, especially in the social sciences and humanities, is significantly less than it was 30 years ago. And therefore, they've been replaced by adjunct professors and contract professors who can be fired like that. So they are not academic scholars who can think, who can teach and research independently, irrespective of politics, but essentially as long as you can, you follow the peer-reviewed methodologies of your discipline, But instead, you're focused on whether your dean will agree, or whether the president will agree, or whether the department chair will agree, which means you're in politics, you're not in academics. So that's very intentional. So as a result, what you'll find, and the other thing that has happened is, if you look back in the 1970s compared to today, and look at what percentage of all public universities' budgets came from the state versus today, it's shrunk to like 25%, which means the other 75%, I'm saying on average, has to come from your tuition dollars, which is why your tuition is so high, and from donors. So those are the two sources that the president cares about. So if you can collectively mobilize some way, that could affect that. But all that is to say that you have to work with tenured professors. Because, I mean, look, the adjuncts and the contract professors make their choices, but they will and can be fired, and they will be fired, especially on this issue, because the donors will back it up, the media will back it up, the president of the United States will back it up. But if you're tenured, at least there's some protection in law and in policy. So you just have to find the right group of people and focus on what you can change, not what you cannot change. Because that oftentimes what people do is they focus on things they cannot change. And then you lose a lot of energy and momentum. And also you have to find allies from different communities, so that you're not just doing it all by yourself. So I'm giving you kind of an abstract, generic response because I don't know the details, but I just wanted, you have to take into consideration the structural limitations so that you don't set yourself up for disappointment, right? And so I say that to say that anybody who's tenured, who's here or listening, we have a very unique responsibility and privilege and burden to engage on this issue, right? And I also think that tenured faculty should be on the front lines in terms of being the publicly facing advocacy, not have students who are getting doxxed, right? And students who are getting harassed and intimidated, although you should report that, and let the students make their decision. It's up to them. But the other side in America, which is what I think are just rabid Islamophobes and anti-Palestinian racists, play very dirty by docs. They punch down. And that is low class. It's a sign of desperation. And it's a form of cheating if you're playing a sport. You don't punch down. Going after students is punching down. They're young, they're vulnerable, they still have careers, and they're much younger than these people. And it's like, come after me. Because they don't want to. That's part of the strategy. Now I'm going to end up getting a bunch of hate mail. Hold on. Are we out of time? Okay. I was going to ask one more.
Well, you're independent. Well, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Assad for us.
Thank you. Let me just, hold on. Before you guys go, I want to do one other thing. I want to show this. Can you go to this next one?
To minimize this.
I have a few more resources for you.
Okay, sure.
I have to figure out how to use a mouse. Okay, so this is just what I wanted to highlight as kind of closing. So these are some of the themes that I hope you came away with, that are not just about Palestinians, but they're somewhat a reflection of our country. That dehumanization of Palestinians is part of the global white European dominance in domestic and international politics. And that's how you can connect it with Black Lives Matter, with Native American movements, with Islamophobia. Free speech rights are and have always been racially circumscribed based on who has the power to enforce those free speech rights. International law is not applied equally to all nations and people. American political system is corrupted by special interest groups and lobbying on various issues, not just on the Palestine issue. US elected representatives are unconditionally supportive of Israel and hostile towards Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians. Anti-Semitism is taken more seriously than Islamophobia, part of the privileging of white people's pain over Black and brown people's pain and human dignity. And the US funds oppression of people in the global South and East, a remnant of the colonial and Cold War eras. Okay, and with that positive note, I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope that you'll all follow the center. And I do have a few books for sale if you use Venmo. Thank you.
Thanks again. I should have said at the beginning, this is